Hi, I'm Dr. Hooton. I'm here in the Department of History at Angelo State, and I'm excited to teach a class in the spring called Rights and Reform in the 20th Century. And this is a U.S. history class, and we're going to be focusing specifically on civil rights movements in the United States since 1940. So for this class, the Black Freedom Movement, the African American side of the civil rights era, is going to be the center point of the class. But we're also going to talk about a lot of other movements at the time. So, for example, we'll talk about the Chicano movement. We'll talk about East Wind in the Asian American movement. We'll talk about the Native American movement and things like the takeover of Alcatraz. We'll talk about the feminist movement and things like the arguments on either side of the Equal Rights Amendment. We'll talk about the war on poverty, labor reform. We'll talk about various sides of the LGBTQ plus movement, including, for example, Stonewall. So we'll be talking about a lot of different events and a lot of different time periods. And one thing we're going to be focusing on is using material written by people at the time, or not even just written by people, but other types of primary sources. So we'll look at music. We're going to look at art, poetry. We're going to read a graphic novel in class. So we're going to use a variety of ways of thinking about history to talk about the civil rights movement. And to get in the mood for this class, I thought I'd give you a few quick fun facts about the civil rights movement that are representative of the types of things we're going to talk about in class. So the first kind of fun and interesting fact is that JFK was sent thousands of pens in the mail by activists. So the slight bit of context for this is JFK on the campaign trail made a comment that he could fix issues with housing reform by the stroke of a pen. And once he got into office, that was not necessarily the first thing that he was focused on doing. And activists knew this. And so they had thousands of people send him pens in the mail to remind him of his promise to work on housing reform. And this is representative of something we're going to do in the class. We are going to talk about kind of the interplay between individual organizing, grassroots organizing, and individual organizations and the federal government, and how sometimes they acted in concert with one another, or talked to one another, but also how there were some separations and a lot of disagreements. So, second fun fact is actually a San Angelo fact. First of all, during the Chicano movement, there were, one of the kind of hallmarks of the movement were student walkouts, particularly in high schools. And this happened throughout the country. Some of the biggest ones were in California, but there were also quite a few in Texas. And interestingly enough, in San Angelo, this was not the first or longest student walkout. There were actually other walkouts that have happened in our history, including a 4-year walkout that started in 1910. And so part of what we'll talk about is longer scale histories that even go way before 1940 that help us understand what's happening during the movement, including the fact that things like Brown versus Board of Education or the student walkouts in the 70s are based on earlier Mexican-American movements, particularly around educational reform. And we are going to talk a lot about Texas history. Some ways, the civil rights movement in Texas did have some similar dynamics to, say, other parts of the civil rights movement in the South or other parts of the civil rights movement in the West. But in some ways, things here in Texas were very different. And so we'll get into some of that dynamic. All right, fun fact number 3. The Beatles song Blackbird is actually based on, or I should say inspired by, the Little Rock Nine. So Paul McCartney a few years ago was on tour, and he actually invited members of the Little Rock Nine to come to a concert, and he brought them on stage and talked to them about how they inspired the song Blackbird. And I want to talk about this, first of all, it's a fun fact, but also because we're going to be talking a lot, like I said earlier, about kind of popular culture and the interplay between popular culture and civil rights. And this is one representative fact also of the fact that civil rights movements in the United States affected people outside of the US. And in a lot of ways, the eyes of the world were on the United States for civil rights. So if you're interested in these facts, if you're interested in learning more, you can come see me in Academic 210C. If you come into the history department, my office is right at the front, and I can talk to you more about the class.